Hello and welcome to Round Around We Go. I am Emily and I use she, they pronouns.
Hello, I'm Paul and I use he, him pronouns.
And today we're going to look at Totteridge and Whetstone. So I think before we begin, we should really apologise to the people of Totteridge and Whetstone, which are two separate places, because it was slightly embarrassing, our lack of knowledge at the beginning of the last program, or the end of the last program.
Well, we confused it with Harrow and Wheelstone.
I did, and you just had no idea where it was. I did eventually get that it was on the Northern Line, but I got it on the wrong branch. So for those who are like us and unaware of the exact location of Totteridge and Whetstone, it's in Barnet. It's the last station before High Barnet on that branch of the Northern Line, just north of Finchley, in the borough of Barnet. So look it up on a map if you don't know where it is, but it is the second last one on the High Barnet branch of the Northern Line. So with that, do you want to do the fact rundown, Paul?
Totteridge and Whetstone Station was opened on the 1st of April 1872 on what was then the Great Northern Railway, transferring to being operated by the London Underground's Northern Line on the 14th of April 1940. Today the station is in Fare Zone 4. Totteridge and Whetstone is in the London Borough of Barnet, and back in 2019 it served 2.52 million passengers. Totteridge and Whetstone Station does not have level access from the street to the platforms. The station was designed by the Great Northern Railway, but the architect is unknown. The origin of the name Totteridge and Whetstone comes from, well, multiple parts. Totteridge comes from the Anglo-Saxon name Totter and a ridge of a hill on which he lived, and therefore means literally Totter's Ridge. It was recorded as being Tatterug in 1248. Whetstone was recorded as being Weston in 1417 and refers to a stone quarry nearby. There is a tradition that there was a wet stone on which knives and blades could be sharpened nearby, which was used by soldiers before the Battle of Barnet in 1471, and hence those two parts, Totteridge and Whetstone, have been combined to make the station which is between the two locations.
Although slightly in Whetstone. It's over the street from Totteridge, so it's technically in Whetstone.
The buses which serve Totteridge and Whetstone Station are numbers 251 and 326, and stopping at the High Road a short walk away are numbers 34, 234, 263, 326 and N20. The labyrinth in Totteridge and Whetstone Station is not one Emily has seen before, and so I will say very quietly that it's in the waiting room on the southbound platform. That's platform 2. Okay, that's the labyrinth done.
Okay, fantastic. When we drew Totteridge and Whetstone, I think we were a bit... we looked at the...
Well, we didn't know where it was.
Yeah, we didn't know where it was. But we also looked at, pictures of the station and thought, this is going to be a pretty nondescript. Yeah. Is there going to be much to say? And we've had such meaty stations so far. And I was pleased to get one that wasn't meaty, so it didn't look like it was rigged. I was very worried looking at it.
Once we started researching, it was the first one where we really were a bit concerned there wouldn't be much to say about it at all.
But, as I've been hearing for the past 2 weeks, as I've been getting lots of messages about Paul's deep dives into everything about Totteridge and Whetstone, there actually is a lot, not necessarily to the station history, but definitely very nearby the station and surrounding the station that was related to the station.
Yeah, I think, the station itself has a fairly simple history, which we're going to start off by talking about in a moment. But then there's, to give you the headlines of the exciting bits around, we have a horse hospital, we have an embankment with lizards on it, we have the Soviets and a radio listening station, we have social housing, and we potentially have a Nazi, but maybe not.
Yeah. So lots to actually be uncovered about this station. So shall we start with the history?
let's start off by talking a bit about the history of the station and how it came to be there and how it came to be part of the Northern Line of the London Underground.
Which is a rather convoluted history involving a lot of different railway lines.
Yeah. So it started off, the station opened in 1872. Originally built by a company called the Edgware, Highgate and London Railway, which was one of those little independent Victorian railway companies of which there were a lot about at the time. And they'd originally started in 1862 with permission from Parliament to build a railway from Finsbury Park, where there'd be a junction with the main line towards King's Cross, up via Highgate and Finchley Central, and all the way to Edgware. And that railway was opened in 1867. But then they also got permission in 1866 to build another branch, which would go from Finchley Central up via Totteridge onwards to High Barnet, which is the kind of part of the railway that we're sort of talking about at the moment. Now, the company was actually taken over by the Great Northern Railway on the 1st of August 1867, and that was the mainline company which operated the sort of express trains from King's Cross towards Northern England, and they also operated a lot of the commuter trains in and out of King's Cross, and they took over this little branch line that was coming off from Finsbury Park, so they would operate all of the trains running from High Barnet through Totteridge, through Finsbury Park, and all the way into King's Cross. And the station then opened on the 1st of April of 1872.
When it was called Totteridge. There
Originally.
was no Whetstone yet, despite the fact it was on the Whetstone side of the road.
Yep, which was a bit controversial, and therefore exactly 2 years later it was renamed Totteridge and Whetstone to satisfy people who wanted to make sure that Whetstone was mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite a small kind of little rural station. The ticket office is up on a bridge across the road with steps down towards the platforms. And that's pretty much exactly the same ticket office that's there today. In fact, there's apparently still 2 stone fireplaces in the ticket hall beneath the windows that were there back when the station opened.
That's pretty cool.
Although most of the interior has been rebuilt since then on, the exterior has been modified quite a bit as well over the years.
So can I just clarify this visually, because I struggle to sort of see it as to what's there today, because I relate things to what they are today.
Yeah.
So that branch, because obviously you can still take a mainline train from Finsbury Park to King's Cross.
Yes.
So does that branch that would then go up to Haringey and Ali Pally, that's not part of this?
No, so this was a separate branch which went from Finsbury Park up through Highgate and then to Finchley and then onwards to Edgware, and a lot of it is now the Parkland Walk.
Yeah,
so the bit from Finsbury Park through to Alexandra Palace, that's now the Parkland Walk.
Yeah, and if people don't know the Parkland Walk, it's sort of a rewilded railway area that you can walk from Finsbury Park up to Highgate, and then there's a second branch that you kind of, we were doing it last weekend, I've done it many times, but it was your first time, and then you kind of muddle around Highgate a bit, and then you can go from there to Ali Pally. So yeah, just to be clear, that's, because in my head I think, oh yeah, this goes from Finsbury Park, but actually no, I mean obviously the Northern Line doesn't serve Finsbury Park, but yeah, just to clarify that.
Yeah, so a lot of the sort of southern half of that railway got abandoned in the mid-20th century. Mm-hmm. And yeah, parts of it are now reopened as the lovely walk that is the Parkland Walk. But that wasn't the case with this end of the line, which it did kind of toddle along as a sort of, first of all, a rural branch line, and then it increasingly became a commuter railway as all these little towns, as they had been, started to become suburbs of London, and lots of people moved there and took the train to work every day. And there would also have been freight on the line. There was a little goods yard that was part of Totteridge and Whetstone station. And then things kind of started to change in the beginning of the 20th century. So people could have got the steam train, which would have gone from Totteridge and Whetstone all the way down, either to King's Cross, or they would have gone actually kind of via a junction at King's Cross, kind of onto other tracks that went next to the Metropolitan line as we know it today, and would have taken the trains to Farringdon or to Moorgate, or they would have gone to Broad Street Station, which has been long ago demolished but used to be near Liverpool Street Station. But it was kind of quite a slow ride in fairly uncomfortable and not very frequent steam trains. And then in 1907, things got shaken up a bit because a tramway opened up that ran pretty much parallel to the railway.
Ooh, trams.
Exactly, trams.
Love me some trams.
Fancy electric futuristic trams, as they were back then, all the way from High Barnet, kind of parallel to the railway, all the way to Archway, when pretty much at the same time a tube railway opened up, what we now know as the Northern Line, from Archway down into central London.
I think it is important to take a moment to just appreciate how massively extensive the London tram network is. High Barnet is High Barnet. It's the top of London. It's the very outreaches of what today is the 32 boroughs of London. And they just had these trams going everywhere. And obviously people connected to other places and took different forms of transport from them. But I think it just kind of blows my mind to think how there was such a massive network of trams and it's just completely gone. There's so few traces of it left.
It was incredible. I mean, hundreds of kilometres of tramway routes, and with interchange tickets between the trams and the tubes, it was this fantastic integrated transport network, which is, almost entirely lost now, other than a couple of historic remnants and then the new system in Croydon. But the trams at the time were basically nicking passengers off this little steam railway. So the number of passengers started to fall. It was increasingly seen as a bit of a backwater. The company that owned it by then, in the sort of 1930s, was the London North Eastern Railway. And they wanted to modernise it and electrify it, but they didn't have any money to do that. And then in 1935, the government announced this scheme called the New Works Programme, which was a massive modernisation programme for all of the transport in London, which was going to cost £40 million, which is quite a bit of money now, although nothing in transport terms, but a colossal amount back then.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was going to be used to modernise some of the mainline railways and stations, electrify some of the lines, and also to hugely extend several of the London Underground lines, including the Northern Line. And what was going to happen on this particular part of it was the Northern Line would be extended in a tunnel from Archway Station, as we call it today, although confusingly it was called Highgate Station back then.
And then there was a couple years where it was Highgate or Archway brackets Highgate while the other Highgate Station was open. Yeah, so to extend it from there up to where it is today, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it'd be extended all the way from Archway through Finchley and then take over this existing steam railway, and that would run the trains all the way up to High Barnet over this old line, and then through Totteridge and Whetstone.
And there were lots of other proposals of things to do with that. We'll definitely, when we get into Mill Hill East, talk a little bit about that proposal. There was a proposal to have another station, because the space between High Barnet and Totteridge and Whetstone is actually quite a large space. There was a proposal to have another station called Willenhall Park or Barnet Vale. We looked up Willenhall Park. Paul was very excited that he found Willenhall Park before he discovered it was in Wolverhampton. But there's a Willenhall Road around there, so maybe at the time there was a Willenhall Park, or maybe it was an estate or something around there. So it would have been sort of smack dab in the middle between those two stations. But it was never built. But you did get this connection built.
Yes, they modernised the railway. They fitted fancy London Underground automatic signals. They electrified all the tracks, and they got rid of all the steam trains and started running London Underground trains, which first called at Totteridge and Whetstone from the 14th of April of 1940, which those of you who have any understanding of history will note is just after the Second World War had broken out, and that was why a lot of the more grand plans to continually turn more bits of the old steam railways into London Underground and build new tube lines and build new tube stations, all of that came to nothing, and why eventually the bit of it that is now the Parkland Walk got abandoned and ended up being the Parkland Walk. And that was supposed to become part of the Underground as well, but never did. But that's a story for another day.
We can get that when we hit Finsbury Park, not that there's not enough to talk about at Finsbury Park. Absolutely.
But you can see there was an absolutely huge change in the railway. So in 1938, when it was still operated by steam trains, there would have been 57 trains per day from Totteridge and Whetstone into central London. Once the tube took over in 1940, there would have been 212 trains per day.
Yeah.
So 4 times as many trains.
It's the difference between living in South London and living on a tube network.
Yes. Back in those days, North London was the old South London.
Yes.
But even though it was owned by the London Underground, there would still have been some mainline freight trains would have used the line right up until 1962, serving the little goods yard at Totteridge and Whetstone, which eventually closed down and then is now the car park of the station today.
Indeed. But there is lots else that was around that station in Totteridge and Whetstone.
When the station was built, right next to it, there would have been a little station master's house where the person who ran the station would have lived. And that lasted up until some point in the mid to late 20th century. And I think quite interestingly, when it was demolished, it was replaced with some housing that was built by an organisation called the Griffin Housing Association. And they were a kind of social housing company, which was, I think, managed by London Transport at the time. And they were building social housing for people who worked for London Transport. And this was something that was discovered by a bit of research by a friend of mine, Neil Dodge. Hello, Neil.
We've had 2 shout-outs to Neil on the podcast so far. He's been doing a lot of good research for us.
He's excellent at digging up unknown little facts. So this is another of Neil's intriguing discoveries, that Griffin Homes was this housing association run by London Transport, who used to have the Griffin as kind of another logo alongside the roundels. So all sorts of things were named Griffin, like you could get Griffin tea that was sold in the London Transport canteens, and there were Griffins on some of the stationery. There were, for the posh managers at 55 Broadway, they would serve chocolate biscuits with Griffins on them.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's...
but not for the regular people who just got digestives.
It's interesting because roundels are so much more the shape of biscuits than griffins are. So,
but the griffins were kind of the classy logo,
yeah,
I think, and the roundel was the everyday logo.
In our future baking London Underground endeavours, we obviously need to put more griffins on the things we bake.
I think we do.
That's how we upscale our bakes.
So yeah, it was this Griffin Homes Association. It got taken over a few years ago by something called the Origin Housing Group, so it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that was
this
in
block of flats.
2004 it was taken over.
Yeah, it's had a 30-odd year history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And presumably, I don't know, if anyone here knows anyone who lives in one of those houses or something, it would be really lovely to talk to them about that experience and what was provided by that and their experience living in those, because that's really cool. Not specifically the ones outside the station, but just Griffin housing more generally.
Yeah, it seems to be a very lost facet of the history of London Transport and the kind of social side of that history.
Absolutely.
Because, of course, most of the history of London Transport is covered by a bunch of railway nerds like me who are more interested in the trains.
But some of us are interested in people too.
Absolutely.
Now, another thing we mentioned very briefly at the beginning is the lizards, which is sort of a throwaway sentence on the Wikipedia page, but we dug a little bit more deeply into that. Not a lot we could find because some of it was in books that we couldn't get. But essentially, the railway embankment between the Totteridge and I can't even say the name of the station, Totteridge and Whetstone station and High Barnet is considered a grade 2 site of borough importance to the London Borough of Barnet because there is a lizard habitat there. The suggestion being that because dogs and cats and other animals can't get into the area, the common lizards can live there, and there aren't a lot of places in the borough of Barnet and probably London more widely in which there are a growing or a thriving common lizard population because there are just so many other animals around that can attack them. So it's a little interesting side point.
Yeah, I mean, certainly all my life living in the UK, I've never seen a wild lizard here. So they must be incredibly rare.
Yeah, I've never seen a lizard before in this country. I mean, granted, I've never had a garden. Well, I had a garden in my first flat 10 years ago, but other than that, still, yeah, they must be very rare. And you think with the number of cats and foxes and stuff around, I suspect the foxes eat them and things. But yes, there's some lizards there, which you can't see because you can't get in there. But
which is the whole point.
Yeah, but it is an area of borough importance. Now, I think something quite unexpected that you were definitely very excited about is the horse hospital. So you dug deep on this one, Paul, so you talk about the horse hospital.
Yeah, I mean, I thought back when we started researching that basically what we've covered so far would be pretty much the extent of the history of Totteridge and Whetstone Station. But then I was looking at the station on Google Maps and kind of noticed that next to it is this burnt out looking old warehouse or factory building. And I got intrigued as to what that was, and I started looking up old news articles, and I discovered there was one from the local paper back in May 2014, which says that this old warehouse had burnt down and that up until 1987 it was a plastic bag factory. And then I looked at some old maps and discovered that back in the 1950s it had been a soft drinks factory. And then I kind of kept on digging into the history of it and discovered it had originally been built, this huge building next to Totteridge and Whetstone Station. It was constructed by the Great Northern Railway, who had owned the station back when it was built, as a hospital for their horses. And I guess it's something that people don't initially think of, is that railways would have horses. You think of them as they run steam trains back in the Victorian era, whizzing people around the country, and horses just don't enter the mind. But actually, through the Victorian era and through the first part of the 20th century, the railways would have owned absolutely vast numbers of horses. Back in the 1880s, the Great Northern Railway would have had something like 1,000 horses working in their terminus at King's Cross Station at any one time.
Yeah, when you think of anything today that might come on train and then is moved by lorries, you would probably be moving those via horses. I mean, I know The Guardian was delivered by horse until 1952. You had package delivery. It was kind of the DPD of the day or whatever, with probably a few less notifications, but things getting moved from place to place or to shops and things via horse. So yeah, those would be a service that the railways would provide.
Yeah, I mean, there was, looking at the statistics for horses, there would have been 27,826 railway-owned horses at the peak of them in 1913. The last railway horse didn't retire until 1967, who works in Newmarket Station, and was a bit of a local celebrity by then as the final working horse. But back in the area that we're looking at, around sort of 1880s through the 1890s, there was something like 300,000 working horses in London. And the Great Northern Railway would have had 1,000 working in the station at any one time. They'd have had another 300 or so that were off-duty resting in the stables. They had a couple of hundred horses for pulling all the goods vans, carrying parcels and luggage and all that sort of thing between people's houses and businesses and the station to be loaded on and off trains. They'd have had horse buses that were pulled by the horses between King's Cross and the other railway stations around, the other terminus stations, so people wouldn't have to go on the Metropolitan and the District Railway, the Underground Railways, if they preferred not to, which I guess
you can't put that through your head. As a person who takes buses, if at all possible, and I have the time, I totally get it. But alas, you can't get into the mindset where you take a bus over a train. That's just
like, what? There was a railway. Why would you go on a horse bus? But anyway, apparently, I get it. I mean, they would have been steam trains underground. That would be not the most pleasant way to travel all the time. So lots of people probably would have gone, let's just get the direct horse bus on street level. But yeah, these thousands of horses owned by the Great Northern Railway would have had a pretty tough life. So it turns out that these horses tended to have something like a 4-year life expectancy when working for the Great Northern Railway.
Wow.
They would originally have been spending a couple of years of the start of their life on a farm, and then they would have eventually been bought by the Great Northern Railway when they were sort of 4 years old or so. They'd have spent about 4 years working for the railway company, and then they would have been just sold
Put
off.
out to pasture.
Yeah, well, they'd have been sold off for other less arduous work in the countryside on farms again.
Yeah.
But they would have been worked very hard for the time when they were owned by the railway company. And depending on sort of what they were doing, they'd have had slightly different routines. So the Great Northern Railway, some of their horses worked 4 days a week if they were the kind of faster moving horses that had a harder life. Some of them worked 5 days a week. So they still had several days off, but they'd have been working 12 hours a day for the days when they were working. So it was strenuous work, pulling heavy loads through the cobbled streets of London as well. Yeah. So not easy to pull a cart over for a horse. But they did have to treat the horses relatively well because they were a valuable investment. Each of them would have cost about £60 at the time, which is the equivalent of about £7,500 today. So, they weren't cheap things for the railway to be just throwing away. They had to take care of them. And this is why, in 1884, the Great Northern Railway decided to build a hospital for their horses next to Totteridge and Whetstone Station. And the horse hospital would have been just basically next to the station. And at the time, Totteridge and Whetstone, the area around there was mostly farmland and fields. So it was quite a pleasant place for the horses to come, compared with a very crowded central London where they would have been working. And they built this huge, basically like a U-shaped building with the stables around the edge of a big courtyard.
Ironically looking like a horseshoe.
Yes, a horseshoe-shaped building for the horses.
Yeah.
And I actually managed to find this article from, I'm going to try and pronounce it correctly, the Newfoundlander.
Yes, good job, Paul.
Fantastic.
You've almost got to my Canadian pronunciation level.
Got the Canadian approval there. Newfoundlander.
No, Newfoundlander.
Newfoundlander.
Yes, Newfoundlander.
The Newfoundlander newspaper from October the 7th, 1884, reported on this horse hospital owned by the Great Northern Railway at Totteridge and Whetstone Station.
Why a bit of, well, which wasn't part of what was Canada at the time, but a sort of little island adjacent to Canada was reporting on this, I don't know. But it's...
I guess it was quite a novel, interesting development, maybe. There can't have been that many hospitals purely for horses at the time, perhaps for industrial purposes, but it seems it was something of note. And they spoke with the superintendent of the horse hospital, who said that a lot of the horses sent down here, they didn't need actual physical treatments, they just needed a bit of rest and a change of air, and they'd have a nice time in the horse hospital in the countryside, and then they'd be sent back. And part of the treatment they had was a Turkish baths for the horses, which was something where there'd be kind of a couple of different rooms that they'd go through. They'd start off with a wash and a grooming room with hot and cold running water, and then they'd go into this room that was like a hot room from there, and then into another even hotter room, and all of which they thought would benefit the horses.
It's essentially a spa for horses, yeah.
Yeah, it was like a little horse spa. And actually, it wasn't totally unique, because a couple of years later, 1872, the removals and van and transport company Pickfords built their own horse hospital with another Turkish bath at their depot in Finchley, which is just a few miles away.
It's interesting that I guess because it is countryside, but you think the hill up, if anyone's ever done the hill from Archway up to Highgate and then farther up onto Finchley, it's quite hilly, although they might have taken a different route that was less arduous, but...
Well, they just took them on the train.
I guess,
so yeah, the horses, because it was the Great Northern Railway, they'd have had horse vans. They just put the horses off the platform at King's Cross straight into a wagon and send them all the way to
that, obviously
Totteridge.
It's like the kind of transport. Obviously growing up in the prairies of Canada, I saw a lot of horses and cows and things being transported in cars. When you say just took them on the train, I immediately imagined a horse stepping on to like a Northern Line train, just ducking in through the door, riding the train up. Yeah, no, okay, that wasn't what was happening.
Stranger things have happened. I do remember seeing on railway Twitter a few years ago somebody taking a pony on a little diesel rail car service in rural UK somewhere.
I love the idea of them sticking, when you put down the window between the carriages, like the horse just sticking its head through to the other carriage, popping up. That was not what was happening. No. It was actual livestock transport.
Livestock vans travelling by train. And I think looking at this article in the Newfoundlander, it was...
You did it, Paul.
Hey! It's interesting seeing what was wrong with the horses. Because it says a lot of them would have had influenza cold or general debility, and among them are several who have what their custodian calls free horses, which is horses that would have worked in pairs. There'd be two of them pulling a van around the streets of London, but one of them would have worked much harder than the other and got itself run down, and therefore when it was kind of under the weather, they'd have sent it up to the horse hospital to recuperate for a few weeks, and it was basically effectively a reward for that horse to spend a few weeks running around in the pasture and in the hospital and having Turkish baths in the spa until it was ready to go back into central London again.
It's not clear as to whether one of them had to work harder because of his actual position within the machinery, or if it was just like one of the horses was super hardworking and one of them was like, nah, I'll just chill a bit here.
Well, it does say they're quite glad that the horses don't know about the fact that there is this horse hospital and communicate with each other. Otherwise, they were concerned that they might have talked to each other and started trying to act ill intentionally so that they would get a holiday.
I feel like there's a reality show in this. I feel like there's a sort of Horses of North London kind of element to this.
And something I found actually really interesting in this article about the horse hospital is that it ends by saying, it's almost a pity that something of this kind cannot be set up for the men employed on the line, so that when they feel used up and grow thin and feeble, they can betake themselves for 2 or 3 weeks to as quiet a retreat and with minds as much at ease. Which is a very valid point.
Yeah, it's almost shocking. Well, it's not actually that shocking that the horses would have been treated better than sort of working class labourers in the Victorian and early Edwardian times. And it led us to a discussion about sort of when paid leave was introduced, which of course was something that unions pushed for. But it was a long time from this point. I mean, it wasn't until the Pay Act in 1938 that meant you had sort of a week's holiday that people on fixed sort of full-time wages, and that was only people with union negotiated wages. Wages fixed by the trade board would get a week's holiday. It wasn't until 98 that you got what you more or less have today, which is 4 weeks holiday time. But to think that these horses were getting, and obviously not to suggest that these horses did not deserve the relaxation. I'm sure those horses were very poorly treated in a lot of ways, or at least just had a very hard job to do. But
with their almost planned holidays, breaks off to the countryside, paid for there by their employer, they were in a way much better treated than the human employees.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect upon. So we've had a little break after the horse hospital, eaten a lot of Easter chocolate. So you might hear that in our voices. But we want to go on to the next interesting bit, which is all about the Soviets.
Which is not something we were expecting to find in Totteridge and Whetstone, the Soviet Union. And it's something I discovered actually when looking through the London Underground Mazes book that had this kind of line at the end mentioning...
Labyrinths. Let's be pedantic, they are labyrinths.
The London Underground Labyrinths book, which mentions, there's this one line at the end of the article on Totteridge and Whetstone, that there was a Soviet Union listening station nearby in the 1940s and 50s.
I'm glad you specified as a listening station, because you did just say, I wasn't expecting to find the USSR in Totteridge and Whetstone, and I was like, that's a weird offshoot that Stalin somehow got a hold of.
Well, he kind of did.
Yes, he did.
So went away and did some research, because what on earth's going on there? And it turns out that a building called The Lodge at 13 Oakley Park North, which is basically just east of the station on the other side of the high road, between 1941 and 1968 was owned by the Soviet Union, and for at least a large chunk of that was used as a kind of radio monitoring station. And it started back in 1941 in the midst of the Second World War, when the Soviet Union was very much our ally, and they were given permission by Winston Churchill himself for their news agency, TASS, to set up a radio monitoring station where they would be able to listen to, I guess, the BBC and other news broadcasts, and then relay what was being communicated in those to citizens in the Soviet Union and put those into the Soviet news broadcasts.
Or was it necessarily to pass those on to citizens, or was that for the leadership?
Well, indeed, that was the supposed intention, but how much of that news actually made it through to the people, I do not know. And indeed, to what extent that was the true purpose of it seems to be, somewhat dubious, because they started getting in a bit of trouble fairly quickly. But initially, it seemed to be a very legitimate thing. So,
it makes sense that they'd want to hear what other countries are reporting and report it back to their own citizens.
Yeah, and it was totally open that it existed. One of the local newspapers interviewed a few people who'd lived around the area in the time, and a guy called Emil Bryden said there used to be these big Russian cars, the Volga cars, driving in and out, and the Russian people who worked there going in and out of the building. And another guy called Wilfred Mead, who used to be an electrician, who lived nearby, did some work in the listening station back during the Second World War. So he was fitting the radio sort of power supplies so that they could keep on working with a backup generator if there were power cuts, and that they were sitting there with all of their, radio aerials and equipment listening into what was going on, and that it was run by a guy called Jim, who seemed to be English. So they were apparently employing local staff, but they weren't just entirely doing this radio monitoring. They started getting themselves in trouble because they were also using the location to produce a kind of thing called the Soviet Monitor, which was a newsletter that they distributed around London that had a lot of libelous comments about people. And these people tried to take the Soviet Union to court, or TASS to court, for printing falsehoods about them. However, Churchill had granted diplomatic immunity to this particular building and the goings-on there, so they weren't able to get any kind of injunctions or libel compensation. So they just had carte blanche to do whatever they wanted and write whatever they wanted, which was obviously a bit of a difficult situation. And then things got even more complicated, because in 1951, it turned out that they seemed to be using it as a spy base. Shock, horror, surprise, surprise. Who on earth would have suspected that?
At the height of the Cold War?
Yes, indeed. I mean, by this point...
It wasn't quite the height of the Cold War, but it was...
Yeah, the
earlier bits of the Cold War.
The UK, being an ally of the Soviet Union, had come to a grinding halt with the end of the Second World War. The Cold War had got underway, and the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir John Slessor, wrote in a top-secret document that they seemed to be using this base in Totteridge and Whetstone to spy on the British air defence system and other British covert activity. And he wrote in a top-secret document, "It is absolutely fantastic that, at a time when we are carrying out a great rearmament programme because of the danger of war with Russia, we should continue to present the Russians on a plate with the opportunity of learning such vital defence secrets."
And that's another one of Paul's voices, which is just a variation on the Queen. He only has one voice he does. It's just the Queen in different registers.
It's different flavours of posh. That's basically all I can do when it comes to voices.
Oh dear.
But that's my Air Chief Marshal voice, and that's our Air Chief of Air Staff voice. And yeah, he was obviously very concerned. And they didn't want the Russians listening in on everything they were doing, and therefore... the clever solution that was come up with was, well, first of all, they were basically afraid that if they tried to force the Russians out, it might actually trigger some sort of hostility. You know, they didn't want to accidentally kick off the Third World War over Totteridge and Whetstone, which would have made it rather more dramatic in the annals of world history than it ever has been.
Yes.
But instead, the government came up with this really rather clever tactic that they would insist on reciprocal arrangements being made, and they could build a listening station in Moscow to listen in on what the Soviets were doing.
Nice, I like that.
To which Stalin said no. And basically the government used that as an excuse to say, well, all right, then you have to clear off out of Totteridge.
Yeah.
And the monitoring station closed in October 1951 after 10 years. But the TASS agency seemed to keep some kind of offices there until as late as 1968.
So we now move back out of the USSR to a little farther back in history to the Nazis. Paul, you dug this one up. This was something else we found, well, Paul found, because I don't let myself look in the Labyrinth's book unless I've already seen the Labyrinth. But Paul found in the Labyrinth's book, which is a rather sort of stretch, but maybe possible.
Yeah, I mean, there is this suggestion that a very high-ranking Nazi Party member called Rudolf Hess was imprisoned briefly in the Tower House at 17 Oakley Park North, so a couple of doors down from the Soviet listening station, in 1941.
So for those who don't know the story of Rudolf Hess, because I'd heard his name, but I didn't know this whole side bit of Britain, he was an interesting character because he originally grew up in Egypt at the time interesting character. He was a horrific Nazi. But in terms of the Nazis generally, he grew up in Egypt at the time in which it was under British rule, and he very much liked Britain and was a big fan of the British Empire. So he was an interesting in comparison to the rest of the people surrounding Hitler.
Yeah, and he was a very early member of the Nazi Party. He joined in 1920. He was with Hitler in 1923 for the Beer Hall Putsch when they tried to overthrow the government of Bavaria. He was imprisoned with Hitler after that and actually assisted Hitler writing Mein Kampf, so kind of right there at the beginning of Nazism. In 1933, he was made the Deputy Führer, so he was effectively second in command to Hitler. And then on the 10th of May, 1941, as a complete unexpected sort of U-turn from his previous position at the top of the Nazi German government, he got in an aeroplane and flew from Germany to Scotland. And
we know that actually happened.
It definitely happened.
Yes,
he parachuted out of his plane, landed in Scotland, and what we know is that he was very quickly captured. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London until the end of the war. In 1956, he was taken to the Nuremberg trials with all the other captured high-ranking Nazis, and then he was given a life sentence. He served it in Spandau prison in Berlin, and he lived there right up until 1987, when he committed suicide at the age of 93, although there is some doubt as to whether he genuinely killed himself or was murdered for, well, complicated political reasons to do with being a last surviving Nazi at the time, still in Spandau prison. And which obviously opens up the question of what on earth was he doing, suddenly abandoning his position at the top of the Nazi government in the middle of the Second World War and flying a little plane to Scotland. The general theory is that he seems to have been hoping to meet up with the Duke of Hamilton, who was Indeed.
Not that Hamilton.
Not that Hamilton, a member of the Scottish aristocracy, who he thought was a kind of opponent of the British government's policy in the Second World War, and he wanted to negotiate a peace treaty between the UK and Germany so that they would join up against the Soviet Union.
I mean, what this Duke of Hamilton, did he have... Why would Rudolf Hess have thought he had the power to do this?
It does seem quite bizarre and really unfounded. As it turned out to be, Hamilton was a close ally of Churchill and Hess was arrested, and none of that happened. There's another theory that actually Hess may have wanted to basically lead a coup against Churchill, possibly allied with, among other people, the younger brother of King George VI, who was the Duke of Kent, Prince George, and maybe a Polish general as well, and they would take over the UK and again ally with Germany. And somewhat suspiciously, the Duke of Kent died in an air crash around the same time. So there's all sorts of dodgy goings on around there. And the exact history behind all of that episode with Hess is very murky and may never come to light fully, because I bet a lot of it's buried in archives somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably papers that would theoretically come out 100 years later or whatever, but they may just not come out. That is something that can happen with
they will disappear down the memory hole.
Yes.
But where on earth does all of this connect in with Totteridge and Whetstone? Well, although it's totally unacknowledged by any official history, the local newspaper for the area managed to find a letter in the archives of Barnet Council, which was written by the owner of the Tower House, number 17 Oakley Park North, in which he was basically trying to convince his neighbours to be allowed to demolish this house that he owned and replace it with a block of flats. And in this planning application, for some reason, he wrote, "We purchased Tower House in 1953 and have operated from here ever since. It was built as a private house. In 1939, it was a boarding school. During the war, it was used at different times as a blood transfusion centre, a fire service station, hence the corrugated iron sheds which existed behind the house, and a prisoner of war cage. Hess was brought here for interrogation after he flew to Scotland. After that, it was unoccupied and derelict until we took over." And the suggestion seems to be that maybe Rudolf Hess stopped off, once he'd been captured in Scotland, stopped off on the way to the Tower of London at this building, the Tower House, next to Totteridge and Totteridge and Whetstone Station, and maybe was interrogated possibly by, the suggestion is Churchill came up there to meet with him and find out what was going on.
It's obviously wild speculation, but I can see maybe Churchill wanting to chat with him. I mean, if he's come over to the UK on his own and abandoned Hitler theoretically, I can see Churchill wanting to sort of quietly meet with him and go, "Hey, what's this about? Are you giving me secret information? Are you turning on Hitler? Are you?" And I can see that wanting to happen in a secret location before things get very open and the Tower of London, and there's sort of, the media finds out what's going on. I can see that happening. It's not, I don't want to say unheard of because I don't know any other examples of that, but it doesn't seem impossible. But the fact that there is just this single piece of evidence makes it seem
it was such a stunning event for this senior Nazi leader to suddenly abandon everything and come to the UK. Apparently the rest of the Nazis were really quite surprised that the British government didn't capitalise on it for propaganda, anything like as much as they did. They never started issuing statements in Hess's name saying, this war is stupid, you should all stop Germany, or anything like that. They just quietly locked him up in the Tower of London and then sent him to prison after the war, up until he died in the 80s. So, it is a weird episode.
Yeah, I would like to find out more about this, but it seems like one of those kind of, and I'm sure there are sort of unsolved mystery podcasts that go deep into this and lots of books and things I'm sure written about the subject, but it is one of those things that it's just, you could dig forever and maybe never find anything.
I mean, certainly, I'm sure there is a huge amount of research to be done. There seems to be almost nothing to indicate that he ever stayed in Totteridge and Whetstone beyond this one letter, but it's certainly a fascinating indication and does add a nice little footnote to the crazy goings-on of Totteridge and Whetstone.
Yeah.
He would have been this was taking place, like literally in a building like 3 doors down from the Soviet listening station.
Yeah. I guess other thing to point out is that there's a lot of celebrities that live around there. Yeah. I don't want to give a list of people, but you can look them up if you want. I don't know if there's anything else we need to cover on Totteridge and Whetstone.
I think it's time to flee Totteridge and Whetstone. Mm-hmm. Not by tube, not to the Tower of London, but by bus.
I don't think he was fleeing to the Tower of London. Very much think he was forcibly brought there. Yes, so my onward connection today. Now, I wanted to focus on those 2 buses that actually go and actually stop at the bus stop labeled Totteridge and Whetstone. So I only had 2 options. And the option I chose is the 326 from Brent Cross to Barnet the Spires. Now, of course, if you get on at Totteridge at Whetstone, you have to go in one of those directions. But I want to talk about the whole bus route. I have a strange fondness for Brent Cross. In fact, Paul and I were having a conversation just a couple of days ago about how he'd never been to Brent Cross. And I was like, you've never been to Brent Cross? And of course, this was actually around the fact that they're building a new station on the Thameslink line called Brent Cross West, which is going to be quite close to Brent Cross. If you don't know Brent Cross, it is a mall. It's kind of a quite run down. My parents said they remember visiting it in 1976, 78, something like that, sometime when they were in London, and they thought it was bright and new and shiny and exciting, which is strange because I come from the city that had the largest mall in the world for a very long time, but I digress. But it is kind of a sort of locked in time kind of shopping mall, a small shopping mall, and it's very, very busy, and it's just, I think because of this giant mall in my childhood, I have a fondness for shopping malls. There's a lot of buses around Brent Cross. It's right on the North Circular. So Brent Cross is interesting to me. And Barnet the Spires is also a shopping mall of sorts. It's a very small one. But also Barnet the Spires is a lot of buses terminate there. The least used buses in London are around Barnet the Spires, just going on tiny little loops around there. But it does feel very suburban. It's almost right by the M25. And it sort of feels like a slightly different world. So my recommendation is a 326 if you were going to take a bus from there. But I do have to give a shout out to another bus. It's one of the ones that goes on the high road, not past the actual station, but this is the N20. Now, I wouldn't recommend a night bus because I know night buses can be unsafe for people and they're difficult for people to ride and stuff unless you're out at night. But the N20 is a particularly exciting night bus. And
can I just clarify that? You're not saying you wouldn't recommend night buses at all for anyone?
No. I think night buses are a perfectly good form of transport and definitely people need to use them. I'm saying I wouldn't make my single recommendation on the podcast a night bus because I know particularly if you're not in central London, or even if you are, that might not be a safe thing to do. So that's what I'm trying to say. Thank you for that clarification, Paul. The N20 was brought up, so I'm in a chat with a lot of other transport, bus and train fans, and someone asked the question, is there any bus in London that goes through the postcode, which is exactly the same as the bus name/number. And this is the only one. The N20 bus goes through postcode district N20, which is the district we're in, sort of northern Barnet. North Finchley, I think, is technically what the postcode district is called. So this is the only one, and I've checked them all. I mean, someone prove me wrong. If you can prove me wrong, that's great. But it is the only one where both the letter at the beginning and the number align with the district it goes through. So that's kind of exciting in an extremely nerdy way.
It's a spectacular bit of nerdiness. It's the intersection of postcode nerdiness and bus route nerdiness to get the one and only bus which goes through its own postcode. I love that.
I don't think that's necessarily true. It's the only London bus that goes through its own postcode. I do not want to make, because someone will be like, oh, there's a bus in Stoke-on-Trent or something like that.
This bus is outside London?
Oh, wow. Yes, yes. The government doesn't seem to know that, but yes, so that would be my 326, and then the N20 just being a little oddity with its postcode situation, which I think brings us to picking out the next station.
And you are literally looking the most excited I have seen you.
I'm literally like bouncing my legs up and down. I'm very, very excited. This is the best bit. I just wait for this the whole time. Okay. Can we hear them?
Yeah, so this is the time when we pick the next station out of our bag. Emily is giving it a good rustle, is picking
Russell
the station
Square. No,
for
it's not
episode
Russell Square.
5.
You just said Russell, so I said Russell Square. But it's not Russell Square.
If it is Russell Square, it'll look rigged.
Oof. All right. Well, something just fell out here, and I'm going to put that back before I go on to the next one, because we don't want to
keep us all in suspense.
So I don't want to lose the stations, and then there's suddenly 269. So our station, far end of the district line, not the one the other side of the district line, we are going to Upney.
Oh, intriguing.
Do we have much to say about Upney? Now, Paul and I last year, were trying to ride our bikes the length of different tube lines in the order they were built, which is its own fiasco. But Upney, we passed Upney. I don't remember what we said about Upney.
I don't remember anything about Upney.
No, me neither.
No. Well, Upney, here we come.
Let's learn some more about Upney. We'll see you next week. So thank you for joining us for another episode of Roundel Round We Go. We hope you enjoyed it. I think we found Totteridge and Whetstone unexpectedly interesting, and I hope you did too. The podcast is produced and edited and researched and basically everything by me, Emily Turner.
And me, Paul Burkitt-Gray.
But our lovely artwork is designed by Colleen McIsaac. You can find them on Instagram at Little Foible Art. Also, we'd love it if you joined us on Instagram and Twitter. I really love our dubious visual puns of each station that's coming up. So if you want to see those, please join us on Instagram at RoundelRoundPod and also on Twitter at RoundelRoundPod. And speaking of Twitter, 2 things we want to let you know about, and they both come from a friend of the show, Felix Johnson. First thing is that he told us we made a mistake in our first episode, Hatton Cross, because the Heathrow free travel zone, you can still travel via train or via underground between the stations for free. It's just you can't travel on buses for free, so we wanted to put that correction. And Felix responded to our first challenge, the challenge to get between Hammersmith and Totteridge and Whetstone, traveling on every different underground line only once. We retweeted his answer, so if you'd like to see that, check out our Twitter. And we have a new challenge today. What is our challenge, Paul?
Our challenge today is to find on the London Underground map a route to get you from Totteridge and Whetstone to Upney, not going through any stations with a U at the beginning of their name.
So, no stations that start with U. You can use the Overground, TfL Rail, the trams, the DLR, or as I like to call it, the DLR, but you can't go through any stations that begin with U. If they're 2 words and either of them begins with U, you can't go through that station. So, that's our challenge. We'd love it if you sent us an answer. You can send us on Instagram. You can tweet it to us, or you can email us at roundelroundpod@gmail.com.
And you don't need to do it for real. Just let us know what your route would be. Draw it on a map. Give us a list of stations, something like that. If you want to ride it for real, you're more than welcome to, but don't send us a 2-hour video of you taking the train.
Yes, Felix just sent us a list of stations on Twitter, which was great. So that brings us to the end, except for, of course, our references. So, Paul, I'll hand it to you to go through your list of references.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily, because of course we do use quite a comprehensive library of sources to inform all of our episodes. And for episode 4 on Totteridge and Whetstone, we used the books London Underground Stations by David Leboff, The Northern Line, An Illustrated History by Mike Horn and Bob Bayman, London's Local Railways by Alan A. Jackson, The Horse World of London by W.J. Gordon, Labyrinth, A Journey Through London's Underground by Tamsin Dillon, Will Self, Mark Wallinger, Marina Warner, Christian Wilmar and Louise Coysh. Why Do Shepherds Need a Bush? London's Underground History of Tube Station Names by David Hilliam. And What's in a Name? Origins of Station Names on the London Underground by Cyril M. Harris. We've used quite a range of other documents for this episode as well, including the 2006 Barnet Unitary Development Plan, Chapter 5. We used the Hansard record of a parliamentary debate on Oakley Park and Friar Barnet from the 20th of July 1950. We used a photograph from the Britain from Above range of aerial photographs. The blog Books, Mud and Compost and Horses by Jane Badger about the fall of the railway horse, the website Striking Women, a report from the 28 Days Later Urban Exploration website about the Planston Works, that was originally the horse hospital by Totteridge and Whetstone Station. We used a couple of articles in the London Underground Railway Society's Underground News publication, and the links to all of those online resources can be found in the full episode notes, along with the publication details of all of the books as well. We've also used several newspaper articles, all of which can be found online, and we've got the full links to those in the references too. A couple of them include the Newfoundlander newspaper from October the 7th, 1884, the Barnet Press from October 1951, several local newspaper websites as well. We've also used several Ordnance Survey maps, which can be found on the website of the National Library of Scotland, and again, full links to those in the episode notes.
Just as a bonus content for anyone who gets this far, it's the Newfoundlander. I can't not correct you on that. I wouldn't be Canadian if I didn't.
I said it right once in the episode. That's enough correct pronunciations of it that I'm going to struggle to make.
Lovely.
Newfoundlander.
You're nearly there. Fantastic. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope you join us next week for Upney Station.